It's for the family album, she always said. At 16, I found a folder labeled Project Lena with hundreds of my photos. Yesterday, I saw that same folder in the house of a woman claiming to be my real mother. Growing up, I always thought it was weird how my aunt would take pictures of me constantly. Not just during birthdays or holidays, but random moments throughout the day. When I was brushing my teeth, doing homework, even when I was sleeping sometimes. She'd creep into my room with that old digital camera and snap away while I was knocked out. I'd wake up to the sound of the camera clicking and she'd just smile and say it was for the family album. My mom never seemed to mind. Actually, looking back now, she seemed almost relieved that someone else was handling the photo documentation of my childhood. She was always busy with work, stressed about bills, and dealing with what I now realize were some serious emotional issues. She'd have these episodes where she'd just stare at me for long periods, like she was trying to memorize my face or something. Sometimes she'd tear up, and when I'd ask what was wrong, she'd just say she was proud of me. The aunt thing got really intense when I hit my teens. She'd show up at my school events, sports practices, even when I was just hanging out with friends at the mall. Always with that camera. My friends started calling her the paparazzi aunt, and honestly, it was embarrassing. But she was family, you know? And my mom always told me family was everything, that we had to stick together no matter what. When I turned 16, I was looking for some old photos for a school project about childhood memories. My mom had told me to check the computer in the den, said there were tons of photos saved on there. That's when I stumbled across this folder buried deep in the file system. It was labeled Project Lena, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold. There were thousands of photos of me. Not just the normal family photos, but detailed documentation of my entire life. Photos of me sleeping from different angles, close-ups of my face, pictures of me eating, studying, even some taken through windows when I was in my room. The dates went back years, organized by month and year with timestamps. It looked like some kind of surveillance operation. I confronted my aunt about it that same day. She got this panicked look in her eyes and started stuttering about how she was just being thorough with the family documentation. Said she wanted to make sure we captured every moment because life goes by so fast. But something in her voice didn't sit right with me. There was fear there, and guilt. My mom's reaction was even stranger. When I told her about the folder, she went completely pale and told me to never mention it again. Said that my aunt had her reasons and that I should respect family privacy. She made me promise not to go through the computer files anymore, which only made me more suspicious. Over the next 2 years, I started paying closer attention to the dynamics between my mom and my aunt. They'd have these hushed conversations that would stop the moment I walked into the room. My aunt would still take photos, but she was more subtle about it now. She'd use her phone instead of the obvious camera, and she'd delete them right after taking them, or so I thought. I also noticed that my aunt always seemed to have money, despite not having a regular job that I knew of. She'd show up with expensive gifts for me, take me on shopping trips, and even offered to pay for my college expenses. When I asked where all this money came from, she'd get vague and mention some inheritance or investments. The weirdest part was how she'd ask me really specific questions about my daily routine, my friends, my plans. It felt like she was gathering information rather than just being a caring relative. She'd want to know exactly where I was going, who I'd be with, what time I'd be back. More detail than even my mom would ask. Senior year of high school, things started getting really tense between my mom and my aunt. They'd have these arguments in the kitchen late at night when they thought I was asleep. I could never make out exactly what they were fighting about, but I heard my name mentioned a lot, along with words like deal and enough and can't keep doing this. My mom started acting really paranoid during this time. She'd check the locks on our doors multiple times each night, and she installed new security cameras around our house. When I asked her about it, she said there had been some break-ins in the neighborhood, but I never heard about any from our neighbors. She also started asking me strange questions about whether I'd ever felt like I didn't belong in our family, or if I'd ever wondered about my early childhood. I thought she was just going through some kind of midlife crisis or something. I told her I felt perfectly fine about our family, which seemed to make her both relieved and sad at the same time. The photo situation escalated again right before graduation. My aunt showed up at our house with this professional-looking camera setup and said she wanted to do a proper photo shoot to commemorate me finishing high school. She spent hours taking pictures of me in different outfits, different poses, different lighting. It felt more like a modeling shoot than a family photo session. During the shoot, she kept making comments about how much I'd grown, how handsome I'd become, and how proud everyone was of me. When I asked who everyone, was, she got flustered and said she meant the family. But we didn't really have much extended family that I knew of. After graduation, I decided to take a gap year before college to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I got a job at a local restaurant and started saving money. My aunt was really supportive of this decision, maybe too supportive. She'd come by the restaurant during my shifts just to check on me, and she'd tip ridiculously well even though I wasn't her server. During this time, I started dating someone from work. My mom seemed okay with it, but my aunt was really interested in every detail about my relationship. She wanted to know everything about my girlfriend's family, her background, where she lived. She even offered to pay for nice dates for us, which I thought was generous but also kind of weird. One day, my girlfriend mentioned that she'd seen my aunt taking pictures of us when we were at the movies. She thought it was sweet that I had such a caring aunt, but it made me uncomfortable. I hadn't even told my aunt we were going to the movies that night. I started paying more attention to my aunt's behavior and realized she was basically stalking me. She'd show up at places where I was supposed to be, sometimes even before I got there. She always had some excuse about running errands or meeting friends, but the coincidences were too frequent to be random. This went on for months until one day, my girlfriend and I decided to follow my aunt after she left the restaurant. We watched her drive to this nice neighborhood across town and go into a house I'd never seen before. We waited outside for about an hour, and when she came out, she was carrying a thick envelope. I confronted her about it later, and she claimed she was just doing some consulting work for an old colleague. But the way she said it made it clear she was lying. She was getting defensive and angry, which wasn't like her usual behavior with me. The breaking point came about 6 months later. I was helping my mom clean out some old boxes in the basement when I found a bunch of medical documents with my name on them. They were from a hospital I'd never been to, and they were dated from when I was a newborn. The weird thing was that the documents listed my mother's name as someone I'd never heard of. When I showed these to my mom, she broke down completely. She started crying and saying she was sorry over and over again. She kept saying that she never meant for it to go this far, that she just wanted to protect me. I had no idea what she was talking about. She finally told me that she wasn't my biological mother. She said that I'd been adopted as a baby, but that there were complications with the adoption that she couldn't explain. She begged me not to look into it further, said it would only cause pain for everyone involved. But I couldn't just leave it alone. I used the information from those medical documents to start researching my background. I found records of my birth at a hospital about 2 hours away from where we lived. The birth mother's name was listed, and I was able to find her current address through some online searches. I decided to drive to her house just to see what she looked like, maybe get some closure about my origins. I wasn't planning to actually talk to her, just satisfy my curiosity. The house was in a really nice neighborhood, much nicer than where I grew up. I parked across the street and watched the house for a while. Eventually, a woman came out to get her mail. She looked like she could be in her 40s, well-dressed, and there was something about her face that seemed familiar. I couldn't place it, but I felt like I'd seen her before somewhere. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed my aunt's car pulling into the driveway. I couldn't believe it. I watched as my aunt got out and walked up to the front door like she belonged there. The woman answered the door and they hugged like old friends. I sat there for another hour, trying to figure out what was happening. When my aunt finally left, I saw her hand the woman another one of those thick envelopes. This time, I followed her home and confronted her as soon as she walked in the door. She tried to deny everything at first, but when I told her I'd seen her at the house, she finally broke down. She admitted that she'd been taking money from that woman for years. The woman was paying her to provide updates about my life, photos, information about my health, my school performance, everything. At first, I thought maybe this woman was just some crazy person who was obsessed with me for some reason. But my aunt's reaction told me there was more to it. She kept saying that I didn't understand the whole situation, that things were more complicated than they seemed. I demanded to know who the woman was, and my aunt finally admitted that she was my biological mother. But she said that my mom, the woman who raised me, was her sister. The two sisters had been in some kind of dispute for years, and it all centered around me. Update 1. I couldn't sleep for days after that conversation with my aunt. I kept thinking about everything that had happened over the years, trying to piece together what was really going on. My mom had been acting even more strange since I'd found those medical documents, barely talking to me and spending most of her time locked in her room. I decided I needed to confront my biological mother directly. I drove back to her house and knocked on the door. When she answered, I could see the shock on her face. She knew exactly who I was. She invited me in, and I could tell she'd been expecting this day to come eventually. Her house was beautiful, filled with expensive furniture and artwork. But what really caught my attention were the photos on the walls and tables. There were pictures of me everywhere, from when I was a baby all the way up to recent photos that my aunt must have provided. She told me her name and said she'd been waiting 18 years to have this conversation with me. She offered me something to drink and we sat down in her living room. She seemed nervous but also relieved, like she'd been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. She started by telling me that she'd given birth to me at that hospital I'd found in the records. But she said I wasn't given up for adoption like my mom had told me. She said I was stolen from her. According to her story, she'd had a difficult pregnancy and had to have an emergency C-section. After I was born, she was heavily sedated and recovering in the hospital. During that time, her sister, the woman I'd grown up calling Mom, had taken me from the hospital nursery and disappeared. She said her sister had been struggling with infertility for years and had become obsessed with having a child. When she found out that her sister was pregnant, she apparently started planning to take the baby. She had connections at the hospital through her work, and she used those connections to forge documents and create a false identity for me. By the time my biological mother had recovered enough to realize what had happened, her sister had moved to a different state and gone into hiding. She'd tried to find us for years, hiring private investigators and working with police, but her sister had been careful to cover her tracks. The breakthrough came when she tracked down my aunt, who had been working as a nurse at the hospital where I was born. My aunt had been involved in the plan to take me, but she'd gotten cold feet after it was done. She'd been feeling guilty about it for years. My biological mother had approached my aunt a few years after I was taken and offered her money in exchange for information about my well-being. She said she just wanted to know that I was safe and healthy, that I was being taken care of properly. At first, my aunt had refused, but eventually the guilt and the money had convinced her to start providing updates. That's where all those photos had come from. My aunt had been documenting my life and selling the information to my biological mother. She showed me a room in her house that was like a shrine to me. There were photo albums filled with pictures of me growing up, school reports that my aunt had somehow gotten copies of, even videos of me at school events and sports games. She'd been following my entire life from a distance. She said she'd wanted to approach me directly many times over the years, but she was afraid of what it would do to me psychologically. She also admitted that she was terrified of my adoptive mother, who she said had threatened to disappear with me again if she ever tried to make contact. The most shocking part was when she told me that my adoptive mother had been periodically contacting her over the years, demanding money in exchange for not taking me somewhere where I could never be found. It was basically extortion. My biological mother had been paying both my aunt for information and my adoptive mother for the privilege of not losing me completely. She said the payments had been getting more expensive over the years, and that my adoptive mother had recently been threatening to cut off all contact unless she received a large lump sum. That's why my aunt's visits had been increasing lately, and why my adoptive mother had been so paranoid and stressed. I felt like my entire world had been turned upside down. Everything I believed about my family and my childhood was a lie. The woman I'd grown up loving as my mother was actually a kidnapper who'd been extorting money from my real mother for years. I didn't know what to say or how to react. Part of me wanted to run back home and confront my adoptive mother, but another part of me was afraid of what else I might learn. My biological mother could see how overwhelmed I was, and she didn't pressure me to make any decisions about our relationship. She gave me her phone number and told me I could contact her anytime I wanted to talk or ask questions. She said she understood if I needed time to process everything, and that she didn't expect me to immediately accept her as my mother after all these years. When I got home that night, my adoptive mother was waiting for me in the living room. She could tell from my face that I'd learned the truth. She started crying before I even said anything. She tried to explain her side of the story. She said she'd been desperate to have a child and that when she saw me in the hospital, she felt like I was meant to be hers. She said her sister had always had everything she wanted and that she deserved to have something good in her life, too. She claimed that she'd given me a better life than my biological mother could have provided. She said my biological mother had been young and unprepared for motherhood, while she'd been able to provide stability and love. But when I asked her about the money, about extorting my biological mother for years, she got defensive. She said my biological mother owed her for raising me, for all the expenses and sacrifices she'd made. She said it was only fair that my biological mother should contribute to my upbringing. I realized that my adoptive mother had no remorse for what she'd done. She still believed she was justified in taking me and in taking money from my biological mother. She was more concerned about losing me than about the pain she'd caused. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend while I figured out what to do next. I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore, like my entire identity had been built on lies. Update 2. The next few weeks were the most confusing and emotionally draining time of my life. I was staying with my friend, but I couldn't focus on work or anything else. I kept thinking about both of my mothers and trying to figure out where I belonged. My adoptive mother kept calling and texting, begging me to come home. She kept saying that she was still my real mother because she was the one who had raised me, who had been there for me through everything. She said blood didn't matter as much as the years of love and care she'd given me. My biological mother was giving me space, but she'd send occasional messages just to check on me and let me know she was thinking about me. She never pressured me to spend time with her or to make any decisions about our relationship. My aunt was a mess. She kept apologizing and saying she never meant for things to go this far. She claimed she just wanted to help my biological mother feel connected to me, and that she'd gotten trapped in the situation over the years. The money had become too important to her, and she'd been afraid to stop. I decided I needed to understand more about what had really happened when I was born. I went to the hospital and tried to get records, but most of the staff from 18 years ago was no longer working there. I did manage to talk to one nurse who remembered the incident. She told me that there had been a lot of confusion and investigation after I went missing from the hospital. The police had been involved, and there had been suspicions about inside involvement, but they'd never been able to prove anything. The case had eventually gone cold. She said my biological mother had been devastated. She'd been a young single mother, but she'd been excited about having me and had already made plans for our life together. She'd decorated a nursery and had been looking forward to taking me home. The nurse also confirmed that my adoptive mother had been working at the hospital at the time and that she'd had access to the areas where the incident occurred. There had been some questions about her involvement, but she left the state shortly after and the investigation had stalled. Armed with this information, I decided to confront my adoptive mother one more time. I wanted to hear her admit what she'd really done, not just the sanitized version she'd been telling me. When I showed up at the house, she was surprised to see me. She immediately started talking about how much she'd missed me and how we could work through this as a family. But I cut her off and told her I knew the real story about what had happened at the hospital. The change in her demeanor was immediate. She went from loving and apologetic to cold and defensive. She said that my biological mother had been a mess, that she'd been too young and irresponsible to take care of a baby properly. She said she'd saved me from a bad situation. When I asked her about the specific details of how she'd taken me, she admitted that she'd used her hospital access to falsify records and create a fake identity for me. She'd been planning it for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. She said she convinced my aunt to help by telling her that my biological mother didn't want me and was planning to give me up for adoption anyway. My aunt had believed her and had helped with the paperwork and logistics. After taking me, she'd moved us to a different state and had created an entirely new life story. She told everyone that I was her biological child, and she destroyed any documents that could link me back to my real identity. The most disturbing part was when she told me about the first time my biological mother had found us. She said my biological mother had shown up at our house when I was about 5 years old, demanding that I be returned to her. My adoptive mother had called the police and claimed that my biological mother was a dangerous stranger who was trying to kidnap me. Since I didn't recognize my biological mother and was scared of her, the police had believed my adoptive mother's story and had arrested my biological mother. That's when the extortion had started. My adoptive mother had told my biological mother that if she ever tried to contact us again, she'd take me somewhere where I could never be found. But she'd also offered to provide occasional updates about my well-being in exchange for money. She'd framed it as my biological mother paying child support, but it was really just extortion. She'd been using me as leverage to get money from my biological mother for over a decade. Hearing all of this made me realize that my adoptive mother was not the loving, devoted parent I'd thought she was. She was someone who had committed a serious crime and had been manipulating and extorting people for years. The love I'd felt from her growing up had been built on a foundation of lies and cruelty. I told her that I couldn't have a relationship with her anymore. I said that what she'd done was unforgivable and that I needed to build a relationship with my real mother. She didn't take it well. She started screaming at me, saying that I was ungrateful and that I didn't understand what she'd sacrificed for me. She said my biological mother was just trying to buy my love with her money, and that I'd regret choosing her over the woman who had actually raised me. When I started to leave, she grabbed my arm and said she'd make sure I never saw my biological mother again. She said she still had ways of making me disappear, and that she'd use them if I didn't come back home and forget about everything I'd learned. That threat scared me enough that I went straight to the police. I told them everything I'd learned about my kidnapping and about the years of extortion. I gave them all the evidence I'd gathered, including the medical records and information from the hospital. The police were very interested in the case, especially since it involved a kidnapping and ongoing extortion. They said they'd been looking for cases like this where children had been taken from hospitals, and that my story fit a pattern they'd been investigating. They arrested my adoptive mother and my aunt within a few days. The evidence was overwhelming, especially once they searched my adoptive mother's house and found all the documentation she'd kept about the fake identity she'd created for me. My biological mother was incredibly relieved when she found out that the truth had finally come to light. She'd been living in fear for years, never knowing when my adoptive mother might disappear with me again or when the extortion demands might become impossible to meet. Final update. The legal proceedings took several months to work through. My adoptive mother and my aunt were both charged with kidnapping, fraud, and extortion. My adoptive mother received a much harsher sentence because she'd been the mastermind behind the whole thing and had continued the criminal behavior for years. During the trial, more details came out about the extent of their crimes. They'd not only stolen me, but had also been involved in falsifying other hospital records and had been part of a larger network of people who were profiting from illegal adoptions. My aunt testified against my adoptive mother in exchange for a reduced sentence. She provided details about how the whole operation had worked and helped the police identify other victims. It turned out that I wasn't the only child who had been taken from that hospital. The hardest part of the whole experience was dealing with my conflicted feelings about my adoptive mother. Despite everything she'd done, she had been the only mother I'd known for 18 years. There had been real love and care in our relationship, even though it had been built on a crime. I had to accept that both things could be true at the same time. She had committed terrible crimes and had caused immense pain to my biological mother and me. But she had also provided me with a stable home and had genuinely cared for me in her own twisted way. My biological mother was incredibly patient with me as I worked through these feelings. She never pushed me to hate my adoptive mother or to pretend that our years together hadn't happened. She understood that I needed time to process everything and to figure out how to move forward. Building a relationship with my biological mother was both wonderful and awkward. She was essentially a stranger to me, but she was also someone who had been thinking about me and loving me from a distance for my entire life. She knew everything about me from the photos and reports my aunt had provided, but I knew almost nothing about her. We started slowly, meeting for coffee or lunch and just talking about our lives. She told me about what she'd been doing for the past 18 years, about her career, her interests, her regrets about missing out on my childhood. She showed me photos of herself from when she was pregnant with me and videos she'd taken preparing for my arrival. I learned that she'd never had other children because she'd been holding on to hope that I would come back to her someday. She'd focused on her career and had become quite successful, but she'd always felt like something was missing from her life. She'd also been in therapy for years, dealing with the trauma of losing me and the ongoing stress of the extortion situation. She'd had to learn to live with the constant fear that she might lose contact with me entirely and with the guilt of not being able to protect me from being taken in the first place. As we got to know each other, I started to see similarities between us that I'd never noticed before. We had similar gestures, similar ways of thinking about problems, similar senses of humor. It was strange to discover these genetic connections after years of thinking I was completely different from my family. I also started to understand what my life might have been like if I'd grown up with her. She lived in a nicer area, had more financial resources, and had a strong support network of friends and extended family. But I also realized that the life I'd lived wasn't necessarily worse, just different. My adoptive mother had given me experiences and perspectives that I might not have had otherwise. We lived more modestly, which had taught me to appreciate things and to work hard for what I wanted. The smaller community where I'd grown up had given me a different kind of foundation than I would have had in the city where my biological mother lived. Eventually, I decided to legally change my name back to what my biological mother had originally chosen for me. It felt like a way of reclaiming my true identity and acknowledging the relationship I was building with her. But I also made the decision to keep some connection to the name I'd grown up with. I used it as a middle name, as a way of acknowledging that both parts of my life had shaped who I was. My biological mother was incredibly generous about helping me transition into my new life. She offered to pay for college, to help me find a place to live, to support me in whatever way I needed. But she was careful not to be overwhelming or to make me feel like she was trying to buy my affection. I ended up taking her up on some of her offers, but I also made sure to maintain my independence. I got a job and started paying for some of my own expenses. I wanted our relationship to be built on genuine connection, not on financial dependence. The most healing part of the whole experience was when my biological mother and I started creating new memories together. We took trips, celebrated holidays, and did all the normal mother and son activities that we'd missed out on during my childhood. She was careful not to try to replace those 18 years or to pretend that we could just pick up where we would have left off. Instead, we focused on building a relationship based on who we were now, as adults who were getting to know each other. I also reconnected with my biological mother's side of the family. I met grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been wondering about me for years.